They, for me, were the greatest heroes of Grand Prix racing back then for many, many reasons. So Fangio jumps out at me.
Nigel Mansell drove 15 seasons in Formula One and clashed with nearly every teammate he was ever handed, a pattern he later attributed simply to beating world champions in equal machinery, race after race. Some of those relationships cooled into grudging respect or even genuine friendship. Others never recovered. Mansell, characteristically blunt about nearly everything, rarely hid which was which. 1. David Coulthard.
I think Damon's had a most fantastic start to a championship, and you know, he should pull it off, I hope, this year.
By 1994, Nigel Mansell was already back in Formula One on a short-term Williams contract, testing the waters for a possible full-time return in 1995. Standing in his way was David Coulthard, the team's young reserve driver, and the competition for that single remaining seat turned personal enough that Mansell, according to multiple accounts from inside the team, barred Coulthard from entering his own garage during race weekends in Japan and Australia. The gesture was pure territorial pettiness rather than anything resembling on-track conflict. The two men never actually raced each other in anger, but it captured something real about how seriously Mansell treated the threat of a younger driver encroaching on space he still considered his.
Now that's a big mistake. The biggest thing we're going to worry about is staying on the circuit.
Sure. Coulthard's own camp responded in kind, according to accounts of the period, with a mock band sign featuring Mansell's photograph crossed out and posted around the Williams pits as a joke that only partly concealed the genuine tension underneath it. Mansell had returned to Formula One carrying a superstar salary from Renault, while Hill, the team's established lead driver, earned a fraction of that amount, a disparity that made Mansell's presence within the team politically delicate before Coulthard's rivalry ever entered the picture. Williams ultimately chose Coulthard for the full-time 1995 seat rather than retaining Mansell, despite holding an option to keep him, a decision that effectively ended Mansell's F1 career after 2 disappointing races with McLaren the following year. What made the Coulthard episode notable within the broader pattern of Mansell's career was its almost comic pettiness set against the far more serious rivalries that preceded it. He had spent over a decade fighting genuine world champions for wins and titles. By 1994, with his own F1 relevance visibly running out, the frustration had narrowed down to a single younger driver and a garage door, a smaller stage for the same territorial instinct that had defined nearly every partnership Mansell had ever been part of. The stakes underlying that pettiness were real enough, even if the garage ban itself looked absurd in hindsight. Mansell delivered his strongest showing of the comeback at the season's final round in Adelaide, out-qualifying both title contenders, Damon Hill and Michael Schumacher, and going on to win the race after the two men collided fighting for the championship. It was the kind of result that might once have strengthened a case for a full-time return, and Mansell later suggested he had been instructed beforehand not to interfere with the title fight and had deliberately taken a slow start to comply. None of it was enough. Williams chose Coulthard for 1995 despite holding a contractual option to retain Mansell, ending the rivalry as decisively as it had begun, with the younger driver simply awarded the seat Mansell had spent an entire season trying to keep him away from. Mansell's Formula One career effectively ended a few months later, after 2 underwhelming races with McLaren, quite close to a conflict that had been fought as much over garage access as over lap times. Coulthard himself never treated the episode as a defining grievance, largely because his own F1 career was only just beginning, and the incident quickly became a minor, almost affectionate paddock anecdote rather than a lasting wound. For Mansell, it stood as a fitting final act, a driver who had spent his career refusing to concede an inch of territory to anyone sharing his garage, still fighting that same instinct on his way out the door. 2. Riccardo Patrese.
What he has achieved personally as a driver is fabulous, and now he's got the 1 win underneath his belt. He should go from strength to strength.
When Nigel Mansell was paired with Riccardo Patrese at Williams for the FW14B's dominant 1992 campaign, the friction that developed was less about open hostility than about Mansell's own relentless need to find any advantage over a teammate he considered his most direct threat for the title. According to engineer Adrian Newey, writing about the season later, Mansell quickly realized that Patrese represented his most likely championship rival within the team and set about systematically demoralizing him. The tactics were sometimes petty and sometimes genuinely strategic. At the season opening weigh-in at Kyalami, Mansell went to extraordinary lengths to be lighter than Patrese, stripping padding from his own helmet and shoes and deliberately starving and dehydrating himself beforehand.
The Jordan team, I think, are just doing a fantastic job, outstanding job under the directorship of Eddie.
A level of commitment that team personnel described as leaving Patrese visibly frustrated once the results were announced. In debriefs, Newey recalled, Mansell would openly steer Patrese towards setup choices that ran contrary to what Mansell himself knew was actually quicker, protecting his own advantage through simple misdirection. Patrick Head, the team's technical director, offered his own account of how the dynamics shifted across the 2 seasons the pair spent together, largely because of how effectively Mansell had learned to trust the car's active suspension system through corners in ways Patrese never quite managed. That technical gap widened alongside the psychological one Mansell had already been cultivating since the first race weekend. None of this ever escalated into the kind of open verbal warfare Mansell had waged with previous teammates. Patrese himself, in accounts given from his own side, described the years working alongside Mansell largely in professional terms, without the personal bitterness that characterized Mansell's other rivalries. But the asymmetry was real. One driver fighting an all-consuming campaign for supremacy within his own garage, the other absorbing it race after race while still finishing as championship runner-up, 20 points behind a teammate who had never stopped working every possible angle against him. The 1992 season made the gap between them almost mathematically stark. Mansell won 9 of the first 10 races, a run of dominance that pushed him to the title with 5 races still remaining, while Patrese, despite closely matching him the previous year, never once looked capable of closing the distance once the psychological groundwork had already been laid before the season even began. Team personnel who worked closely with both men noted that Patrese seemed genuinely unsettled by the small, accumulating slights, the setup misdirection, the weigh-in theatrics, in a way that compounded whatever technical disadvantage he was already carrying. Mansell never publicly framed his conduct that season as anything other than professional preparation, the ordinary business of extracting every possible advantage over a direct championship rival who happened to share his garage. But the account left by his own engineers made clear the campaign had been deliberate and sustained rather than incidental. A full season spent quietly working to keep his most credible internal threat exactly one step behind, whatever it actually cost their working relationship in the process. Patrese's own graciousness about the partnership afterward, largely free of complaint despite everything Newey and Head later described, made the asymmetry striking. He continued to speak well of his time at Williams and of Mansell specifically, a generosity that stood in sharp contrast to how deliberately his teammate had worked to ensure it was never actually tested on equal terms. 3. Alain Prost.
You know, he's so young, he's courageous. He's a son of the great Gilles Villeneuve, so the genes are all there.
Alain Prost joined Ferrari for the 1990 season, the same team Nigel Mansell had already spent a difficult year fighting for relevance within, and the pairing produced friction serious enough that Mansell later cited Prost directly as a reason he avoided returning to a team that included him. Mansell discovered that a Ferrari chassis he had put on pole position at the 1990 French Grand Prix had subsequently been handed over to Prost for the following round at Silverstone, a suspected favoritism that Mansell treated as confirmation of exactly where he stood in the team's internal pecking order. Even with the swapped chassis, Mansell still claimed pole at his home race that year and led for most of the afternoon before his gearbox failed, a result that did little to soften his reading of how Ferrari had chosen to allocate its resources between the two drivers. Mansell was blunt in later interviews about what separated Prost from a driver like Senna in his estimation, describing Prost and Piquet together as very political animals, prepared to do whatever it took to win, in explicit contrast to what Mansell considered his own, more straightforwardly competitive instincts. That grievance outlasted the single season the two men spent together at Ferrari. When Williams pursued Mansell for a return ahead of the 1993 season, Prost's presence in the team was a significant factor in Mansell's decision to walk away from Formula One entirely, rather than accept a contract that would have placed the two men back in the same garage, choosing instead to take his newly won world championship to IndyCar and leave Prost the clear #1 driver he wanted at Williams. The 1990 Ferrari season itself had been a difficult one on nearly every level. Not simply the chassis dispute, Mansell struggled with reliability for much of the year, while Prost, in his first season at Maranello, quickly established himself as the team's clear priority, taking 4 victories by the season's halfway point against Mansell's single win. That disparity in results made the suspected favoritism over equipment feel to Mansell less like an isolated incident than confirmation of a pattern he had already begun to suspect throughout the year. Mansell's decision to leave for IndyCar rather than accept a Williams seat alongside Prost carried real professional cost. He was walking away from Formula One as the reigning world champion at the peak of his commercial value, over a personal judgment about one specific teammate rather than any dispute with the team itself. Williams got his championship anyway in 1993, with Prost driving largely unchallenged in Mansell's absence, a result that did little to soften Mansell's retrospective view of exactly what his refusal to race alongside Prost again had ultimately cost him. 4. Ayrton Senna. Nigel Mansell and Ayrton Senna arrived in Formula One the same year, and by 1987 their rivalry had turned dangerous enough to produce one of the sport's defining collisions. At the Belgian Grand Prix that August, Mansell went around the outside of Senna's Lotus in a passing attempt, and Senna, rather than yielding room, squeezed him toward the wall, sending both cars into the barriers. Mansell was furious enough afterward that he confronted Senna physically in the paddock, an incident that became one of the most talked about flashpoints of the entire decade. Mansell later described the earlier phase of their rivalry in blunt terms, recalling that in the beginning they were great enemies, and that Senna wanted to win at all costs with everybody, knocking heads with nearly the whole field in the process. What set Mansell apart from many of Senna's other rivals, in his own account, was his refusal to simply accept the intimidation Senna directed at most of the grid. Senna, Mansell said, could intimidate pretty much every driver, but after Spa he realized he would have to readdress his approach specifically where Mansell was concerned, since Mansell would not cave. That standoff produced a shift neither man could have predicted from the wreckage at Spa. Over the following seasons, their fights, most memorably a wheel-to-wheel duel through the streets of Barcelona in 1991, remained fierce but stopped costing either driver a race, and Mansell later credited that mutual willingness to race hard without knocking each other off as the foundation of a genuine friendship that developed as both men aged out of their most combustible years. By the time Senna died at Imola in 1994, Mansell's assessment of him had evolved into open reverence rather than lingering resentment, calling him a true thoroughbred racer and naming him, without qualification, the toughest rival of his own career. Few of Mansell's rivalries traveled that particular distance, from a physical confrontation in a paddock to an unqualified tribute delivered after his rival's death. But Senna's did, even if the frustration at the center of it in 1987 had been entirely real. Mansell was careful, in later interviews, not to stand down how genuinely hostile the early years had been in service of the friendship that eventually followed. He remembered clearly that Senna wanted to win at all costs against everybody on the grid, and that the Spa collision had been the direct product of that approach, meeting a driver who simply refused to yield the way most of the field did. The friendship that followed was real, but Mansell never pretended the frustration that preceded it had been anything less than genuine. 5. Nelson Piquet. Of every teammate Nigel Mansell was ever paired with, none produced language as consistently harsh as Nelson Piquet. The two-time world champion Williams brought in for the 1986 season specifically, Mansell believed, to put him back in his place as the team's clear number 2. Piquet did not hide his resentment at Mansell's early pace, and the relationship deteriorated from there into something Mansell himself, years later, summarized without qualification. Piquet, he said, is just a vile man. The hostility ran in both directions from the start. Piquet made demeaning remarks about Mansell and his wife that went well beyond ordinary competitive needling, comments Mansell considered a genuine breach of any professional boundary between teammates. Mansell, in his own autobiography, described the partnership plainly, writing that it was fair to say he didn't exactly see eye to eye with his new teammate, before elaborating elsewhere that the two men shared no relationship whatsoever, not even a professional one. Across the 2 full seasons, they were forced to share a garage. Some of that bitterness was rooted in genuine grievance over how Honda, the team's engine supplier, appeared to favor Piquet with power delivery once Mansell's data suggested a discrepancy on the straights, a suspicion Mansell never fully let go of even decades later. Piquet, for his part, dismissed Mansell's technical understanding entirely in a contemporaneous interview, saying flatly that the Englishman knew absolutely nothing about setting up a car, a remark that only confirmed for Mansell exactly how little regard his teammate held for him. The championship the two men fought over in 1987 slipped away from both of them, Mansell losing it by a whisker to Alain Prost, despite winning twice as many races as Piquet that season. Unlike the wreckage with Senna, which eventually gave way to friendship, or the cooler resentment toward Prost, the Piquet relationship never softened into anything resembling reconciliation. It remained, in Mansell's own final word on the subject, exactly what it had always been. The 2 seasons together produced a full accounting of grievances on both sides that neither man ever fully walked back. Piquet resented that Mansell, a driver he considered his clear subordinate on arrival, had regularly outqualified and outraced him through 1986 despite Piquet's status as a 2-time world champion, and he made his displeasure known through the team rather than to Mansell directly, complaining that his new teammate had never worked with his engineers the way a proper number 2 was expected to. Mansell, for his part, never accepted that framing of the relationship in the first place, having already proven himself a genuine title contender before Piquet's arrival. What ultimately distinguished the Piquet rivalry from every other frustration Mansell carried through his career was its total resistance to resolution. Senna mellowed. Prost's friction eventually settled into a cool professional distance. Even Patrese, on the receiving end of a full season of calculated psychological pressure, spoke of Mansell afterward without real bitterness. Piquet and Mansell simply never got there. 2 former teammates who spent decades afterward describing the exact same partnership in almost identical terms of mutual, unresolved contempt. Neither man ever offered the other the kind of retrospective grace that softened Mansell's other rivalries over time. Piquet continued dismissing Mansell's technical understanding of a race car well into later interviews, and Mansell, for his part, never once revised his own final verdict on the man, delivered flatly and without embellishment that Piquet was simply vile. 5 drivers, 5 shapes of frustration, a petty garage ban, a quiet sabotage campaign, a grievance that rerouted a career, a rivalry violent enough to end in friendship, and one that never did. Mansell forgave nearly everyone. Piquet remained the exception.